Hi there, it's Gabriele Nicolet from Raising Orchid Kids and SpeechKids, where we teach little kids to talk and help parents understand their little kids. And today we are talking to Michelle Mullaley. Mullaley or Mullaley?
Mullaley, you had it right.
Mullaley. Yeah. Perfect. And I'm going to let her tell you about herself. So Michelle, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This is really exciting to talk about because it's not always a topic that parents think about as connected, about mental health and diet of their children. So I'm glad to get to talk about that. Just a little background on me. I am a clinical psychologist. I'm co-owner of Bridges Therapy and Wellness Center. We're a private practice in Fairfax that serves mental health need of local children and families. And I do therapy and I do a fair amount of testing. And part of why my partner, Dr. Erica Schilling, and I opened Bridges was because we had an interest in wellness as a lifestyle, not just as it relates to someone who's struggling with their mental health. And that's where nutrition comes in. And so sometimes part of that wellness journey is us helping parents understand the nutrition connection to behavior and emotions in children. Well, and then themselves. It certainly applies to us as adults as well.
What's so interesting about this work is like we are working with the kids, and in so doing, parents often self-identify on various things.
Absolutely.
As their kids are going through something. And so that can be a really interesting process. So, okay, we have jumped right into this nutrition and mental health or mental wellness. Mm-hmm. Why are we even talking about that? Sketch it out for us.
Well, we're talking about that because it's one of the things that we don't often think about from a how to support kids perspective. Like we know we want our kids to eat their fruits and vegetables. We think about that from a physical health perspective. But what we often aren't aware of or aren't talking about is the impact of nutrition and diet on the gut and how the health of the stomach and the bacteria in the stomach impacts our neurotransmitters and impacts the inflammation in the brain. And those are the things that then turn around and impact behavior and emotions. So we have to take several steps back to think about how we can use food in a mental health promoting way.
And so this gets really interesting because often when kids are acting up or having emotional challenges, so we have kids who are unhappy. I call them orchids, but we also call them sort of fretful kids, right? Those are the high maintenance. They're whiny. They're sad a lot. They think that life isn't fair. It is a leap, and you just outlined it, right? It's several steps backwards in the food chain, to get to what probably is part of the underlying issue, because we now know, based on pretty recent research. I want you to talk a teeny bit about the research.
Sure.
Like in terms of how old it is, that there are more neurotransmitters in our gut than there are in our brain. Yes.
Yes, for some of the neurotransmitters. And in fact, that's actually where some of our neurotransmitters that are most implicated in emotion and behavior originate or are created. So the field is called nutritional psychiatry. And it is like the last maybe 10, 15 years at most, but probably less than that it's really gotten in vogue, where you really can see it in the culture or media, that the way that we eat impacts how we might feel or behave. And so the idea there is that what we eat impacts our belly. So we all have bacteria in our belly. We need to have some bacteria in our belly. We usually think of bacteria as a bad thing to have, right? Like, don't lick that, don't touch that, but wash your hands. But actually, a lot of what we need in our belly is bacteria, but there's quote unquote good kinds and quote unquote bad kinds, right? And so if we have a diet that is high in sugar, processed foods, things that don't look like they showed up in nature, what happens is that we don't have as much of the good bacteria in our belly. And in fact, it feeds the not such good bacteria and makes them crave more. It's why if we have a high carb, high sugar diet, we just crave more carbs and sugar. We don't crave carrots, right? And so those not healthy bacteria make us want to eat more of the stuff that isn't so great for us. The problem is when we have more of the quote unquote bad bacteria than we have good bacteria, we're not making enough serotonin. And serotonin is that key neurotransmitter that is implicated in regulating emotion and regulating behavior. So we see struggles with anxiety and depression more in individuals who have an unhealthier diet. That's one of the reasons. Of course, it's all multi-determined, but it's the kind of thing as a parent we can control. We can help our child have good habits around if we know that.
And I think this is, I mean, you alluded to it earlier. It's like we want our kids to eat their fruits and vegetables because they should.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then when they don't, it's like, it'll happen later. It's fine.
Right.
And, I'm thinking actually particularly of kids on the autism spectrum, many of whom have high fat, high carb, high sugar diets, because that's what it's this
they're willing to eat.
catch-22, right? Where the very thing that they crave is actually making them feel worse.
Yes, right. Because they want the noodles or the chicken nuggets or the, over the fruits and vegetables. There's texture issues and sensory issues tied in there for sure.
Yeah.
And frankly, some of the not as healthy stuff does release some other hormones within us that feel good in the short term. And
say something else. Say more about that.
Yeah. So we have dopamine receptors. Those are our pleasure neurotransmitter. And when things are momentarily pleasing to us, whether that's a video game, social media scroll that was interesting, something with high sugar, we get a little squirt of dopamine in our brain and it feels good. And so who wouldn't want more of that? But we get more dopamine from a Pop-Tart in that short term than we get again from like the carrot or the watermelon. And so it isn't in the moment as reinforcing. And so it's hard to convince a child why they should do that thing that doesn't feel as good. It's hard to do that for ourselves too.
I was about to say, not just children.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm hungry. I'll have an apple or I'll have a cookie. Like, which one are we going to want to flock to? But the closer we are to nature, the more likely it's going to promote the things we need in our belly to help create the neurotransmitters that we need. And that's one of the things I think is just kind of the most important to teach kids young, because it's hard to teach them if they don't already have that habit growing up and that exposure to the healthier foods. It's hard to teach your 13, 14, 15-year-old all of a sudden why those things are important. But yeah, it can create some battles with young ones.
And then oftentimes what's the other piece of this that's interesting to me is when we have real little kids, they often have just kind of grown up feeling bad. They're struggling with sensory integration issues. Many of the kids, and this is the kids who come through my practice, they're struggling with sensory, they're struggling with feeding. And so they don't know that they're supposed to feel different than they do. And then they have behavior problems. I actually saw a little guy last week, had a whole bunch of antibiotics in the NICU right after he was born. And now at 2.5, we're dealing with some behavior again. And I put it in quotes because what we're talking about kind of is like a whole brain meltdown, right? It's not like he's not running away because he's bad.
No, kids, no, absolutely not.
But his system is seriously out of whack in terms of his bacterial, whatever profile.
When we kill bacteria, that's the stuff we don't want, right? Like if you have strep, we're also killing the good stuff. And so it is one of the many reasons why we don't want to overdo antibiotics, because we need to have some bacteria. We need to get a little bit dirty sometimes. It's, I think, especially hard after COVID when people's immune systems are a little bit more suppressed because we've had 2 years of wearing masks and not going out and not being exposed. So especially little ones who've been born or, toddlers in this last couple of years, their immune systems likely look different than kids several years born several years earlier. But we need those bacteria. It's part of our immune system too.
This is so interesting. You just gave me a thought about all the anxiety we're seeing. And isn't that so interesting that at the very moment that our immune systems have been so suppressed because we've been so isolated that we're also, look, there's other reasons why people are anxious.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so multi-determined, but each piece is important to still look at.
That's so interesting. Yeah. So go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say the other thing from a food intake perspective that is, I'll say more, I won't say totally anecdotal, but more anecdotal because it's not as firmly supported in the research, is that for a small subset of people and children who we're talking about mostly, right now. There's a sensitivity to some of the foods that are separate from the bacteria and the gut health part, that kind of some people are more sensitive to inflammation in the body and the brain, in particular related to dairy, the whey protein in particular, and gluten. And that's not somebody who necessarily has like an allergy to milk, right? It's a different thing to have a sensitivity than an allergy, or an allergy like a celiac disease. It's different than those. It's more of a sensitivity to where the nervous system gets more activated for some people by those foods, which, you know, eating cheese, eating milk, eating wheat bread, those are good things for us to be eating, unless you have a sensitive body. So the other thing I sometimes will talk to folks about is just trying a couple of weeks without one of those. You know, we want to be scientific kind of, so do one at a time. Let's try a couple of weeks with no dairy, see if we notice any decrease in some of the kind of irritability, anxiousness, heightened nervous system behaviors. And then slow, like one at a time, just introduce and watch and observe. You know, here, try a piece of cheese and we'll have a grilled cheese sandwich or something. And so you get to see if you have one of those kids who is more sensitive, and it's a less intrusive, invasive way of trying to intervene than some of the other options might be. And the same thing with kind of gluten-based foods. I've certainly kind of, again, anecdotally, if you talk to a parent of a child who is sensitive about those things, they will swear all day long that they see the difference. And it really can exist for some people, not everyone.
And not everyone. And sometimes we, you know, we stop the gluten or the dairy or whatever other thing we think might be an irritant, and we don't see any difference, which is interesting, because this, I'm glad you mentioned the inflammation. Because there is this whole sort of inflammation theory out there. And I always think of it, and you can sort of weigh in here, but I always think of it as like bandwidth. Like every organism has a certain bandwidth that they can tolerate for pollutants and irritants and food additives and sleep disruption, right? Like all of these areas of development of brain function, we all come with, again, this like range. And if we ride, you know, if our range is sort of wide, but we ride at the top 20% most of the time, and then we overdo it on, we eat a tub of ice cream and we're lactose sensitive or sensitive to the whey protein, right? We're dairy sensitive, then we feel awful. But if we have, you know, like whatever, glass of milk here and there, or a piece of cheese, such and so, and it doesn't have any effect.
Right. Yeah. So in our field, we call that the window of tolerance. How much can you tolerate before you are dysregulated? And some people have a wide one, some people have a narrow one, exactly what you're saying. And it could be different from day to day based on things like sleep, stress, you know, your sensory sensitivities. There's lots of things that's based on, and that's true for all of us. And so helping kids understand when they're at the top of their window tolerance so that they can signal, or we as parents can pick up on that, can make a big difference in how we respond or how we adjust the environment for them to bring it back down. Teach coping skills, teach mindfulness or calming, manage nutrition, get enough sleep. There's lots of ways we can help kids either stay within their window of tolerance or help them expand it even.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because it's both and, right? It's like stay within, do compensatory strategies so that you could stay within your window, but then let's also do some therapies and some interventions and some whatever we do to expand that window of tolerance. I love that. Yeah, that's exactly, and that's in fact exactly what we're doing in speech therapy as well. We're expanding that frustration tolerance. We're expanding that repertoire of what it is that you can handle while you also stay regulated. And it's a big deal, like a dysregulated system. All of the neuroscience research is pointing in exactly the same direction, which is when we are unwell and dysregulated, we are not learning. Brain is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's just trying to survive.
Yeah.
And that's when we see, again, like in quotes, the behaviors and the mental health challenges and other kinds of things. Yeah.
Right. And all of those things impact, like even when you talk about stress or different things that are happening environmentally, not just nutrition. Of course, that's one of the things we're here to talk about, but they actually impact your gut as well. Actually, we know that people who've been in, highly traumatic childhoods, they have a different gut biome than people who have not, in a not healthy way. So then they're, again, not making the very neurotransmitters that they need to be able to cope with the things that are going on for them.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so, okay. So aside from, and this may be outside the scope of this conversation, but aside from like encouraging our children to eat healthily and reducing colorants and preservatives and, shopping on the outsides of the grocery store,
Mm-hmm.
what else is out there for people who are, they have a narrow window of tolerance, they have food sensitivities, they have kids who only eat Kraft mac and cheese or Annie's if they're lucky.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do we do with those guys?
Well, I think probably first and foremost, especially if we're talking with parents and who are parenting young children with some of this dysregulation challenges, is one of the things we also know is that kids cannot regulate sometimes by themselves, and they need us to regulate with them. And which means we need them to borrow our calm instead of us borrowing their stress, right? When they're acting up and activating, and it activates us and we get triggered and stressed and right, then we're joining them where they are. Now we've got two overloaded people and nobody coping well, which happens to all of us, right? We're all at risk of that. So being mindful of, I need to help loan my child my stillness. I said borrowing my stillness, so that they can kind of calm, because we're going to co-regulate together. That's how they will eventually learn to do that for themselves. But for now, they need us as the adult in the room to do it for them and with them. Mm-hmm. Let's take some breaths. This is really hard. You look really uncomfortable right now. And empathy and joining. And then once there's calmness, now the brain is going to be able to come back online. We call it offline, right? When you're just in this emotional brain, you can't think, you can't problem solve, you can't make good choices. But if we can help our kids get their brain back online, get calmed down because they're borrowing our stillness, now we can problem solve, troubleshoot, how we can handle this differently. What is it that you need? Can you tell me now? Can you show me now? Which they couldn't do when they're activated.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I love what you said about borrow my stillness. What did you say? Lend them ours. Wow. Lend them our stillness instead of borrowing their stress.
Yeah. Really, because isn't that what we need? Even if you come home at the end of a rough day, that's what we need our partners to do sometimes with us is, gosh, that sounds like a terrible day. Why don't you have a seat? Let's talk it through, or let's do something to calm. Our kids need that. They don't have the resources we have, but we forget that sometimes when we're stressed out as parents too, because it's not easy, especially if we're raising a child who's not neurotypical and has different needs than we always can predict.
Yeah. And so if parents think that there's a nutrition aspect to whatever's happening, obviously they're going to see someone like you.
Actually, probably I'm going to send them. I'm going to talk to them about what I know that I, have learned, but I am not a nutritionist. So I kind of want to stay in my wheelhouse. And at that point, I'll kind of do a little bit of psycho ed as we're talking now. And then I'll try to either encourage them to see someone who is a pediatric dietitian that can help them with some tips and tools to manage the nutrition. And sometimes even working with a functional medicine doctor is also helpful because they work from kind of at the cellular level, what's going on.
So dietitian, functional medicine. I just, sometimes you don't know what to Google. Right?
Yeah. Those are good ones for sure.
Gastroenterology.
I think if you have a reason to believe that is kind of a true allergy, then yes, that is certainly, I would always say recommend to rule out anything medical. There are real disorders in regard to both of those things, as well as other areas that nutritionally, even having Crohn's or irritable bowel, there's lots of other things that are good to rule out, but
okay. Fantastic. I think this was helpful and your pediatrician. Yes. But here's my thing, not to throw pediatricians under the bus, but if you don't get a positive response from your pediatrician, you can still ask the questions.
I would
Right?
encourage you to still ask the questions and ask them of other people, because the medical model is that we treat when there's a problem or an illness. I mean, we go to well checks, and that they all certainly do some systems checks all around. But for the most part, I mean, they're going to ask, usually, I know my kids' pediatricians, they do ask about, are they getting some fruits and vegetables? And they're overall looking at some health pieces as well. But for the most part, they're there to help when someone's ill, right? And so they're not necessarily ill if they're acting up. And so that's where you may need to go to a speech therapist, an OT, a psychologist or therapist, the nutritionist that's pediatric focused, who are looking at different parts of the system.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And looking, yes, exactly. Not at sort of at physical health only. And some pediatricians are amazing at that, and others, they don't have the time. They're not set up for that. They just, it's okay. But
and some know that, which is great. And they refer because they know that that's not maybe their wheelhouse.
Exactly. I think this was helpful for a lot of folks. Thank you so much. If people want to get a hold of you, how do they do that?
They can go to our website, www.bridgestherapyandwellness.com. That's and spelled out. So bridgestherapyandwellness.com. Or they can email me at Mullaley, which is my last name, Mullaley at bridgestherapyandwellness.com.
So fun to have you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Best to you.